This is The Night Witch. The Night Witch is a Metroidvania, a 2D Metroidvania that is using some bullet hell elements, actually quite a significant amount of bullet hell elements. And at first I was thinking that I'd never actually played a Metroidvania where you can fly right from the start, but then of course I remembered that Aquaria exists, and even though technically you're more swimming in Aquaria than flying, the concept is the same in a 2D space. And since you can fly right from the start in this game, that means your overall traversal is going to be quite a bit different than your traditional Metroidvania formula, because you don't have to worry about getting the double jump and getting the glide and all those other things that you would generally get a hold of in order to open up the map. And in this case, instead of platforming challenges, you have ahead of you during exploration and stuff quite a lot of dash timing challenges and things like that that take the place of where traditional platforming would be, since you technically can't jump and can instead fly. That means all of the overall design of how these areas connect and stuff has to be a little bit different than usual, and overall I think I've actually done a pretty good job at that. But to start off with, how does it actually play? What's it like? Well, The Night Witch is all about, of course, exploring, fighting bosses, going through all these various areas and fixing all of their problems. But something you'll notice right from the start is that you have a projectile weapon instead of a melee weapon, and pretty much all of the combat in this game is done at range. All of the enemies use projectiles, well, most of the enemies do, and the vast majority of your attacks also create projectiles, which means the majority of the game's difficulty is not as so much from like attack timings and stuff like that, like is traditional in a 2D game like this, but is instead about dodging through and understanding the gaps between large bullet hell patterns of, well, bullets. So you can expect just about every enemy you face to have some sort of recognizable pattern to their shots that you're of course expected to memorize and learn how to work your way around without getting hit. And speaking of getting hit, the first thing to note is that you only have 3 hearts to start with, and these are not segmented, meaning they don't like halve or quarter when you take damage. 1 hit is 1 heart, so that means you only start the game able to take 3 hits at most. This game is quite difficult, I should mention. It doesn't start off too difficult. It starts off pretty gentle. It gives you a good amount of time to get used to how the game controls and how the combat works and stuff. But after a specific point, it really starts to test all of your skills, and it definitely gets very challenging later on in the game. But first off, the world. What's the world like? Because of course the world building and the overall exploration is an extremely important part of any Metroidvania, and in this case you're mostly underground, because the plot is that the Night Witches, the titular force of do-gooders, fought an incredibly destructive war on the surface of this planet, and it shattered the sky in a very literal sense. There's cracks in it, and this made the surface completely unlivable, so all of humanity had to go underground, where they found this giant buried ancient machine that helped them actually live. Now, to be fair, this whole humanity gets driven underground to live for a while is not a novel plot, right? I'm sure we've all seen several different plots like this before, so this is not a new concept, it's not a particularly original story, but I feel that it is actually done pretty well, mostly because the characters that you interact with are actually relatively interesting, and the world itself is very well realized. It's extremely beautiful. Something that you've probably noticed already in the background is that all of the artwork for the environments are stellar. Like, they all look really, really good. The backgrounds especially are very detailed and really lush looking in a lot of places, and in other places they're very devastated and like burned out looking. They have a lot of detail to them, and they're really cool to see, but they critically do a really good job of helping to keep the game readable, because one of the big problems with a 2D game like this, if you're using lots of projectiles on screen like a bullet hell does, is that busy backgrounds can make for a very hard to read game. And in this case they've done a good job of actually differentiating so that all the stuff in the foreground is generally pretty obviously part of the foreground. I've never been confused so far playing the game by a projectile that I thought was part of the background, or by a platform I didn't know would stop me, or something like that. The line between background and foreground is generally very well illustrated, to the point that all these areas can be very beautiful and very detailed, but also still keep the game readable. You have a sort of hub area that you will start all of your adventures off from, and there are several different zones in the world that you will eventually end up going to as you progress through the game, and each one has its own theme and its own sets of enemies and things, and of course its own boss and other various hazards that you'll face along the way. But you can also rescue people, which will send them back to the hub and allow you to speak to them. Some of them will even give you side quests and stuff later on, but more on that in a minute, because one of the interesting parts of this game is the way that you gain power is unusual. You do not have like an experience gauge or something like that. Instead, you have the link meter. It looks like a bunch of chains. And when you get people to thank you or believe in your calls or otherwise want to support you, you gain link from them. And of course, every time the link gauge maxes out, you'll level up 1. And the level up system is kind of interesting because it presents you with 2 different paths, the Knight and the Witch path, and you have to choose one. You don't have to choose the same one every time. You can choose from either one each time you level up, but you can only pick 1 per level. The Knight path tends to be very direct, things like increasing your basic projectile damage, increasing your fire rate, increasing your time of invulnerability when you get hit, stuff like that, physical stuff. whereas the Witch Path is about increasing your mana, increasing your spell damage, increasing the chance that enemies will drop more mana, and some stuff like that. This chance, by the way, also presents itself whenever you find one of the health up collectibles, the kind of thing that would normally give you an extra heart container in a game like this. Instead, it gives you a choice. The Night Path will give you an extra heart container, but the Witch Path will give you 1 extra maximum mana you can hold and 1 extra deck to your spell card deck, which is something else we'll get onto in a minute. But what this link system really means is that you're encouraged to explore around the areas a lot and save as many people as you can, because this is the main way that you're actually going to get it. Every time you talk to an NPC for the first time or save them from a bad situation, you'll gather some link from them, and this is the only way you can level up, so you need people to trust you. And I think it's kind of a neat system that they added the narrative that witches get their power from other people believing in them and actually made it a game mechanic. But what about all this spell card stuff I was talking about? So the combat in this game is, as you would expect, very hectic and very fast-paced. It is, of course, very bullet hell inspired, so you're seeing tons of projectiles on screen at any given time. You do have a dash that you get very early on in the game. The dash is more of a blink, really, and it gives you some immunity frames that are very well appreciated, because you absolutely need them to get past some of the more intricate bullet patterns that you'll be facing in this game. And timing your dashes correctly is one of the prime skills that you'll actually need, and in fact, a lot of the exploration is based around this very thing, so you'll be dashing a lot in this game. And the dash actually has like almost no cooldown at all. You can spam it pretty quickly, but there are noticeable moments of vulnerability between dashes, so it doesn't make you invincible. You have a basic projectile weapon at all times that just fires relatively slowly and does okay damage. It's a basic kind of shot that just attacks wherever you're facing. Interestingly enough, the game actually has 2 different shot modes. You can use the right analog stick or the mouse to aim your shots, or you can just not touch the aiming controls and just hold the shot button down, which will cause the shots to auto-aim. However, this does way less damage than if you actually aim them yourself. This is kind of an interesting idea because it allows you to, if you're having problems avoiding bullet patterns and aiming at enemies simultaneously because your brain just gets all twisted up, you can just do less damage but do reliable damage instead of twisting your brain up and trying to do both at the same time. I think it's kind of a cool idea. I tend to try to aim almost all the time because it does significantly more damage, but I like the fact that they give you this option to have a sort of auto-aim attack that is basically useful but not extremely useful. As you hit and kill enemies, you'll also be gathering these blue orbs. These are mana, and you have a deck of spell cards that you build yourself. There are these beacon things that act as checkpoints, and they allow you to, whenever you're resting at them and drinking some coffee, to just manage your spell card deck and actually swap it out with other cards you happen to have. You can collect cards from all sorts of ways. Bosses tend to give you one that's relevant to one of the boss's attacks, and you'll tend to find them in out-of-the-way places while exploring as well, in these special card-shaped chests that are always fun to find. But spell cards all have a different cost of mana, and they're bound to your X, Y, and B buttons, or 1, 2, and 3 on the keyboard, and they just come out as soon as you cast them, as long as you have the mana to do so. And your deck will always consist of more than 3 cards, and whenever you cast one, it will randomly put another one from your deck in it. So you can't really control exactly what you're drawing at any given time, but you will be able to control what your deck consists of. So you're encouraged to create a deck of powerful cards that you think will be useful to you with no dead space, so that you're always drawing something useful. And these cards tend to be very powerful indeed. There's things like a shield of rocks that protects you from all sides, or one of the boss's huge like Toho spell card like bullet hell attacks that cost 6 mana to use, to some more generally usable stuff like a sword that homes in and stuns the enemy it hits and does a fair amount of damage, a crazy laser thing that always aims away from wherever you're facing, or these axes that clear away bullets that they hit and sweep around you in a circle. There's all kinds of spell cards. They're really fun to use actually, and it's really fun to just build a deck of them because they're so powerful, but they of course rely on this mana resource that you don't always have, and you really have to do well in combat to generate more mana in general, especially in things like boss fights, where you're generally rewarded with mana for sustained damage on the boss. But of course, if you don't really care all that much for the spell card system, you don't really have to use it. You can just go full Night Path and just make your basic attack really, really strong, and you can fill pretty much all of your spell slots with weapons, because there are also weapons that you can put in the spell card slots, and they will replace your basic pew-pew attack with something more fancy, from a machine gun to a shotgun to a big cannon that pierces enemies to a rocket launcher. There's a bunch of them. I think there are like 9 or so different weapons that you can find, and they all tend to be very useful but very costly to have, but one of the later Night Path upgrades actually makes each weapon last longer, so if you want to build a whole sort of playstyle around just using basic weapon attacks and not fancy spells and stuff, you actually can do that. Importantly for a Metroidvania, Exploration is really, really fun in this game. You can fly from the start, of course, which means that you can get to a lot of areas, but it does still manage to gate them off behind other things, like at first your dash and the ability to go underwater, or the ability to open certain doors that require an actual melee weapon that you get later to use. It's very hard to use in combat, but it does tremendous damage if you manage to hit with it. It can also destroy bullets, which is very useful sometimes. But yeah, so there are still the classic Metroidvania elements of collecting new powers for yourself and opening up areas because of this. They just tend to be based more around gear or spells that you find, rather than pure movement capabilities aside from the dash, because, well, you can fly. There are also some other hazards you'll be facing aside from just normal rooms full of enemies and environmental hazards like lasers and spikes and stuff. There's also ambushes that happen sometimes, which are rooms that you get locked into where large waves of enemies will spawn in that room and you have to just try and survive the waves and beat them all down as quick as you can. There's even a couple of special rewards for finishing these rooms in a certain way, like you get the Frost Moon badge from one of these rooms for beating it really quickly, and there's also a Sun badge for beating it without taking any damage at all, which I've only gotten like 2 or 3 times in the whole game, but it is possible. And the boss fights are also really fun. The boss fights are generally, they punctuate the actual zones themselves, so there aren't a tremendous number of bosses, but they tend to really carry their weight for that area and be a good test of the different shot types and things that you found on enemies in that area up until that point. They tend to be quite challenging and also very hectic encounters that are definitely really fun, but I do have to mention the way this game does difficulty, because it's a little bit strange. If you plotted the difficulty curve for this game out, it would look like a staircase, right? Like it plateaus for a while and then jumps up very suddenly and then plateaus again after that, and just kind of repeats. Basically, there are 2 huge difficulty spikes in this game that are actually foreshadowed by a boss. In fact, they're foreshadowed by the same boss twice, because you fight them multiple times. And what you'll find is after this boss fight, not only will the boss be much harder than any boss that's come before them, but afterwards the areas you face will be significantly, like drastically harder than anything you've faced up until that point. So I think this might turn some people off at first because the difficulty spikes are very noticeable, right? They're like huge jumps in difficulty both times it happens. Once you get to places like the Forge Fields, for instance, the ambushes there just get completely evil, like really mean stuff. Like the devs were inspired by Plutonia or something. They're really mean ambushes, and they are very, very hard to take down. In fact, I actually managed to beat the final boss of that area my very first try, but the last ambush took me like 8 tries to get through. So the difficulty definitely noticeably jumps up there, and then again, once you get to the factory on the surface, it jumps up a second time to be really, really hard. And I think that overall, this method of upping the difficulty in big jumps after like a story important boss fight might turn some people off just because it's such a drastic sudden increase. I personally don't really mind too much because it is at least narratively foreshadowed by this boss fight and things getting really serious afterwards, so it does kind of make sense that things would get a lot harder, and I'm also used to like bullet hell shmups where each stage is like a large jump in difficulty, so it's kind of familiar territory for me anyway, but still I think it's something that I should mention, and even in my case, even when I'm kind of used to it, I still think that the factory difficulty near the end of the game is actually a little bit much in a couple of ambushes. Sometimes it gets really hard, and that's mostly down to the fact that some of the late game enemies have like extreme amounts of health for some reason. You'll face like 2 or 3 different enemies in some of the later areas that have like drastically more health than anything else, and I'm not entirely sure why. But it is overall a really fun experience. I think that if you can get past the rather evil difficulty jumps here and there, it is a genuinely enjoyable Metroidvania with some great music, some really fantastic visuals and fun exploration, and some really fun bullet hell combat. So if you're in for this sort of thing, then you could definitely do a lot worse. I think it's actually at a really good price. I think $20 is really fair because it lasts a pretty good amount of time. There's a lot of content here, and it is, so far at least, enjoyable all the way through if you can ride those big difficulty spikes. So thank you guys very much for watching. I will put a link to this game's Steam store page down in the description below this video, and I'll see you next time.